Martin's Rebellion. A story of black resistance in the Union Army. Written and edited by Mansa Foday Ajamu. Dedicated to the descendants of Charles McClellan alias John Martin. In the wake of Major General William Tecumseh Sherman's devastating March to the Sea and Carolinas campaign, a pivotal moment unfolded in South Carolina during the American Civil War, marked by instances of mass emancipation from chattel slavery, introduction of controversial freedmen's labor contracts, and black rebellion in the Union Army. The story of my ex-great-grandfather Charles McClellan alias Private John Martin of the 128th USCT Regiment Infantry is an untold tale of one man's struggle for freedom at the end of the war. Before departing from Atlanta for Savannah on his famous March to the Sea, Sherman gave explicit orders in his Special Field Order No. 120 regarding the conduct of the campaign. The following is an excerpt from those orders. 7. Negroes who are able-bodied and can be of service to the several columns may be taken along, but each Army commander will bear in mind that the question of supplies is a very important one and that his first duty is to see to them who bear arms. 1. Hence, the order and policy issued prior to the campaign, authorizing able-bodied freedmen to be taken along by the Union Army, was issued in Atlanta on November 9 and it commenced on the 300-mile, 480 kilometers, march 6 days later on November 15, 1864. Sherman's army executed a scorched earth policy, destroying strategic military targets as well as industrial infrastructure and civilian property, disrupting the Confederacy's economy and transportation networks. His decision to attack from within enemy territory without supply lines was unusual for its time, and is regarded as an early example of modern warfare or total war. As the Union Army swept through the Georgia countryside, thousands of freedmen decided to follow the army and forage the abandoned properties of their previous slaveholders. While the army dismantled and destroyed the infrastructure, Sherman's bummers raided and pillaged along the way. Some of them eventually became United States colored troops, and this policy would continue with the Carolinas campaign as well. Many of the freedmen families emancipated during the march were among those granted 40 acres and a mule within the modern-day U.S. Gullah Cultural Heritage Corridor territory. On December 21 the campaign ended with the capture of the port of Savannah. A few days later, Sherman wrote in a letter to Henry W. Halleck on December 24, 1864 that, "We are not only fighting armies, but a hostile people, and must make old and young, rich and poor, feel the hard hand of war, as well as their organized armies. I know that this recent movement of mine through Georgia has had a wonderful effect in this respect. Thousands who had been deceived by their lying papers into the belief that we were being whipped all the time, realize the truth, and have no appetite for a repetition of the same experience." 2. Having gifted President Abraham Lincoln the city of Savannah as a Christmas gift, the Carolinas campaign commenced on January 1, 1865. This campaign was the second and final scorched earth campaign conducted by Union forces. Sherman is most popularly known for his March to the Sea, but I'd argue that his campaign through the Carolinas was more destructive, decisive, and vengeful. He pledged to make an example of South Carolina due to the leading role played by the Confederates from that state during the secessionist movement and Civil War. Sherman and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton held a historic meeting with 20 Gullah Geechee community leaders on the evening of January 12, 1865 in Savannah, Georgia. During this meeting the Gullah Geechee leaders selected Garrison Frazier as their spokesman. Frazier was asked to state in what manner you think you can take care of yourselves, and how can you best assist the government in maintaining your freedom, to which Frazier answered, "The way we can best take care of ourselves is to have land, and turn it and till it by our own labor, that is, by the labor of the women and children and old men, and we can soon maintain ourselves and have something to spare and to assist the government. The young men should enlist in the service of the government, and serve in such manner as they may be wanted. We want to be placed on land until we are able to buy it and make it our own." 3. He was then asked to state in what manner you would rather live, whether scattered among the whites or in colonies by yourselves, to which he once again intelligently replied, "I would prefer to live by ourselves, for there is a prejudice against us in the South that will take years to get over, but I do not know that I can answer for my brethren." 4 days after this meeting Sherman issued Special Field Order No. 15 on January 16, 1865. These wartime military orders provided for the confiscation of 400,000 acres of land along the Atlantic coast of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. This stretch of coastal lands was to be divided into parcels of not more than 40 acres each, on which were to be settled approximately 18,000 formerly enslaved Gullah Geechee families. Hence, Sherman's Special Field Order No. 15 is the only time in United States history that formerly enslaved black people of African descent were granted land reparations during the conflict as a collective. Unfortunately, this land would later be taken back by the federal government and returned to the former Confederate rebels and their families by the President Andrew Johnson administration. 4. The battle at Rivers Bridge began on February 2, 1865 and was the first substantial resistance of the Confederate opposition that Sherman's troops faced in South Carolina. This Civil War battleground is now a state park, located in Earhart in Bamberg County. Confederate General Lafayette McLaws ordered that the bridges crossing the Salkehatchie River be burned or blocked in order to stop the Union Army from crossing. The battle that resulted lasted for 2 days, but eventually McLaws' soldiers were forced to retreat to Branchville, located in Orangeburg County. The plantations of prominent South Carolina elite families and leading Confederates were occupied and foraged. Among these slaveholding elites was notable 19th-century author William Gilmore Simms and the Woodlands Plantation located in Bamberg County, President of the South Carolina Secession Convention David Flavel Jameson and his Burwood plantations located in Barnwell County, and others who were viewed as treacherous enemies of the United States of America by Sherman. It was reported by the Simms family that some of the formerly enslaved people from Woodlands decided to follow the army as Sherman's bummers. Union soldiers destroyed the South Carolina Railroad, as the Union Army advanced north, completely severing the connection between the Confederate garrisons at Augusta and Charleston. The Battle of Aiken was fought on February 11, resulting in another Union victory, and the army set out for the town of Orangeburg. Confederate Lieutenant General William Hardee was convinced that Sherman's troops were going to attack Charleston from Orangeburg. Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard was based at Columbia, himself becoming more convinced that the Union Army was coming his way next. Major General D.H. Hill was in Augusta, thinking that Sherman was heading for him. This general state of confusion highlights the geographical centrality of Orangeburg in the region at the time. The Confederates did not know where Sherman would attack next, from this strategic position deep in the heart of the Palmetto State. Here you have enemy forces in Augusta, Columbia, and Charleston who could not figure out the Union Army's next move. Hardee posted a defense line under McLaws along the Edisto River from Orangeburg to Branchville, attempting to protect both Columbia and Charleston. On February 12, 1865, Hardee went to the Orangeburg-Branchville line and reported to Confederate President Jefferson Davis that he was still not certain whether enemy intend going to Columbia or to Charleston. Beauregard, on the other hand, understood that if Sherman captured Columbia, Charleston, and Hardee's troops would be cut off. The Union Army entered the town of Orangeburg and torched public buildings, businesses, and private homes. Sherman arrived soon after, finding that about half the town was destroyed as his troops approached the Congaree River on February 13, 1865, plundering everything in sight en route to Columbia. Since January 1, 1863, when Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation went into effect, the Union Army had functioned as a liberating force in relation to those enslaved in Confederate states. In the context of Sherman's campaigns in Georgia and the Carolinas, it should be recognized that his scorched earth tactics freed thousands of black families from chattel slavery while also breaking the back of the Confederate Army. My third great-grandfather was among a group of enslaved men and women, forced to labor at the Confederate Army camps during the Civil War. Legend has it that he was kidnapped prior to the war, while following a marching band. It was said that he was drawn to the drumming and ended up captured. During the war, he was forced to labor at an enemy camp where he was responsible for handling the cattle. He was in this condition until one day the Union forces raided the camp and freed him. It was passed down by word of mouth through the generations that Charles McClellan was not his original name and that he changed his name in relation to his previous service in the Union Army. He was the second son of Benjamin McClellan and Irene Johnson, born in 1840, and although there is no birth certificate or plantation records to determine where or by whom he was last enslaved, I discovered the death certificate of his elder brother Israel McClellan, on which his parents' birthplaces are both listed as Orangeburg, South Carolina. His parents, who were born into slavery in 1817 and 1822, did not have surnames. However, Benjamin adopted the McClellan surname and Irene adopted the Johnson surname because, like many newly emancipated families, they more than likely identified with the surname adopted by their relatives for whatever reason they saw fit. Charles McClellan's story was narrated by elder descendants at a McClellan reunion in Charleston, South Carolina in 2005 and had a profound impact on my late mother. Knowing that I would be excited to learn this story, I can still remember the look in her eyes as she told me her version. Since then I have been searching for the original surname of our great McClellan patriarch and to learn more about his military service history. I reasoned that his former surname could be found in his military records as an alias or maybe in his pension files, which typically have autobiographical information included. In continuing the research into the background of my ancestor, I held private conversations with a number of elder descendants from multiple branches of the family to gather additional information and insight. My late mother believed that the McClellan surname was originally Smith, and one of my elder cousins believed the first family surname was Wright. Under the impression that the first surname was Smith as my mother believed, I started from there and found a man named Charles McClellan alias Charles Smith who served in Company B and K of the 23rd USCT Regiment Infantry in Virginia and later served in the Navy from 1869 to 1879. Given the oral tradition and belief that Charles was either a Smith or Wright in the Army before officially changing his name to Charles McClellan after the war, I initially thought the case was closed. However, further research into his pension files disqualified him from being the same person as my third great-grandfather. In early 2021, I hit the jackpot when I came across the 11th Census of the United States, Special Schedule, Surviving Soldiers, Sailors, and Marines, and Widows, etc., in Burns Township, South Carolina located near Ridgeville, Colleton County, now Dorchester County, dated June 1890 and discovered Charles McClellan listed on row number 6 as the same man who served as a private in Company G of the 128th USCT Regiment Infantry under the alias John Martin. Turns out that his alias first name was not Charles and that neither Smith or Wright was his alias surname in the Union Army. After identifying the correct alias, regiment, and company of Charles McClellan, I was able to concentrate my efforts on obtaining his military records and the 128th USCT. I found a book titled, Borrowed Identity, 128th United States Colored Troops Multiple Name Usage by Black Civil War Veterans Who Served with Union Regiments Organized in South Carolina, compiled and edited by John R. Gordon, and got my hands on a copy. This book is a mind-blowing compilation containing 76 genealogical and biographical entries from the pension records of colored troops that served in the same regiment as my ancestor. Gordon says, the 128th USCT was one of the 6 infantry regiments of newly freed slaves from the Low Country area of South Carolina that enlisted to serve with the Union, and also identifies 3 128th USCTs who were originally enslaved in Orangeburg as well. Due to the multiple name usage of colored troops in this particular regiment, his book highlights how USCT veterans had to bring forth witnesses to support their identity claims in order to receive pension benefits. For example, Harry Dixon alias Harry Lewiston served as a private in Company K of the 128th USCT. He was born in Virginia circa 1830 and brought to Orangeburg by John Livingston, but freed before enlistment. He enlisted on March 7, 1865 at Beaufort, South Carolina and honorably discharged on October 10, 1865. According to his autobiographical information provided in his military records, Harry followed Sherman's army as bummer from Orangeburg to Wilmington, North Carolina, where he says, "They put a whole lot of us on a transport boat and took us to Beaufort, and then I was enlisted in Company K, 128th U.S. Colored Infantry." There was also the stories of Sheck Thomas alias Jacob McAllister of Company K, Jacob Frazier alias Jacob Kidd of Company K, Lewis S. Glover alias Lewis S. Connor of Company H, and Irwin Rowe alias Irwin Nero of Company F, whom were all formerly enslaved in Orangeburg as well. From the neighboring Barnwell district originate other 128th USCT comrades such as Frank Gadsden alias Thomas Trawell of Company G, Isaac McCreary alias Isaac McCray of Company K, and Milledge Hankerson alias Milledge Wimberly of Company K. There was also Thomas Harrison alias Thomas Wade of Company K from Aiken. These are some of the formerly enslaved men, emancipated during the Carolinas campaign from the modern-day counties Orangeburg, Aiken, and Barnwell, who followed the army as bummers from Orangeburg to Columbia and ultimately Wilmington, North Carolina. 5. On April 14, 1865, the War Department held the historic, raising the flag at Fort Sumter, ceremony in the Charleston Harbor. Famous abolitionists William Lloyd Garrison and Henry Ward Beecher participated in the ceremony. South Carolina has the distinction of being the first Confederate state to secede from the United States of America and the first to engage in active combat with the Union Army. When Martin R. Delany was appointed by President Lincoln to serve as major for the 104th USCT, attached to the Department of the South with headquarters at Camp Stanton on Hilton Head Island in Beaufort, he became the highest-ranking black officer in the Union Army. He recruited from among local Gullah Geechees in Charleston to restore the capacity of the 103rd and the 104th while starting the 105th USCT regiments. Delany was among the prominent personalities present for the celebratory occasion. Delany, who was born free in Charlestown, West Virginia, and obtained formal education during the antebellum period, became a doctor, journalist, editor, intellectual, world travelers, and firebrand abolitionists. He emerged as one of the first and most prominent black nationalist and Pan-African leaders of the 19th century. In fact, he was in Nigeria negotiating land grants for the African diaspora in the West seeking to repatriate back to their motherland continent, when the Battle of Fort Sumter took place on April 12, 1861, nearly 4 years to date before this historic flag-raising ceremony. Considered by historians and political scientists alike to be the father of black nationalism, Delany arrived at the ceremony with Robert Vesey, son of Denmark Vesey, aboard the Planter. The Planter was the Confederate naval ship piloted by the legendary Robert Smalls, who stole the ship and turned it over to the Union by running the Confederate blockade outside of Charleston Harbor. This day would go down as one of the most memorable because President Abraham Lincoln was shot in the head by his assassin John Wilkes Booth while attending the play Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. He was pronounced dead the next morning at 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865. His assassination, silencing the cheers of Union victory, brought uncertainty to many of the freedmen and USCTs alike who feared being re-enslaved. Lincoln was succeeded by his vice president Andrew Johnson, who was a Democrat born in North Carolina that ran with him on the National Union Party ticket in the 1864 presidential elections. He was in favor of the rapid restoration of the seceded states to the Union, without protection for the newly freed people. Meanwhile, the Carolina campaign continued and culminated in the Union defeat of Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston's army at the Battle of Bentonville, and its unconditional surrender to Union forces on April 26, 1865. 20 days later, a circular letter, dated May 15, 1865, in the records of the Freedmen's Bureau Commissioner, asked all commissioners, however appointed, who have the charge of freedmen, to report the character and extent of their work. Several weeks after that, on June 12, Charles C. Soule responds in an official report from Orangeburg titled, Chairman of the Orangeburg, South Carolina, Commission on Contracts, to the Freedmen's Bureau Commissioner, enclosing a speech to the freed people, and the commissioner's reply. 6. Soule reports in his own words that, upon the occupation of this district by the U.S. troops, affairs were found to be in a very unsettled state. The scouts, who had latterly enforced local order and preserved discipline upon the plantations, were disbanded. No civil magistrates had power to act. The planters, uncertain as to the wishes of the United States authorities, were afraid even to defend themselves against aggression and robbery, while the Negro laborers, who in this neighborhood outnumber the whites 5-1, already excited by the prospect of freedom, were urged to lawlessness and acts of violence by the advice of many of the colored soldiers. Not only was there every prospect that the crops would be neglected, but it also seemed probable that the Negroes would revenge themselves, by theft, insults, and violence, upon their former owners. He goes on to explain that officers detailed for the purpose of averting starvation and disorder were sent out to both blacks and whites alike. Racial tensions were alarmingly high amidst a general state of lawlessness and anarchy. This new freedman-labor contract relationship was controversial and viewed as unfairly imposed on many of the emancipated persons of African descent by the Freedmen's Bureau in Orangeburg District and other parts of the state. However, Soule reports to Major General O.O. Howard that the commission originally consisted of 4 members, afterwards of 5, and this number is at present reduced to 2 by the establishment of an auxiliary board in Columbia, South Carolina. The limits of jurisdiction are indefinite, and cases are frequently brought to our notice from remote districts. The report reads, in the 2 weeks which have passed since the commission was appointed, several hundred contracts have been approved, as many plantations visited, and probably 2,000 whites and 10,000 blacks have been addressed. The officers engaged in this work have frequently ridden alone and unarmed 25 miles, or further, from the post, and have almost invariably met with courteous and hospitable treatment at the hands of the planters, most of whom seem desirous to comply in good faith with the wishes and orders of the government, and to make the best of a system of labor in which, notwithstanding, they thoroughly disbelieve. According to this account, a commission with less than 5 members at its peak had successfully managed to within 2 weeks oversee contracts with an estimated 2,000 whites and 10,000 freedmen. They did this alone and without arms, with hospitable treatment from the former slaveholding planters, effectively locking the formerly enslaved into a new system of racists' labor exploitation. Soule continues with his report and states, it is found very difficult to disabuse the Negroes of the false and exaggerated ideas of freedom they have received, in a great measure, from our own colored troops. They have been led to expect that all the property of their former masters was to be divided out to them, and the most reasonable fancy which prevails, is that besides receiving their food, clothes, the free rent of houses and gardens, and the privilege of keeping their hogs and poultry, they are to take for themselves all day Saturday and Sunday, and to receive half the crops. Their long experience of slavery has made them so distrustful of all whites, that on many plantations they persist still in giving credit only to the rumors set afloat by people of their own color, and believe that the officers who have addressed them are rebels in disguise. While this Freedmen's Bureau Commission on Contracts in Orangeburg was conducting its research for the report and in my opinion coercing the largely illiterate and vulnerable into neo-slavery, there was a growing rebellion in the ranks of United States colored troops, stationed on garrison duty at Camp Stanton. According to my ancestors' military court-martial records, Private John Martin of the 128th USCT deserted from his post, armed with his Army-issued Springfield rifle and ammo on June 4, 1865. However, he did not act alone, and when he was eventually brought back to Hilton Head it was with a group of rebellious comrades. Ironically, they were returned on the same date that Charles C. Soule made his report to Major General Howard concerning the labor contracts and state of disorder in Orangeburg. It is important to note that both the report and the return of my ancestor to custody occurred exactly 1 week before the last formerly enslaved families in the United States were officially emancipated when Union troops arrived in Galveston Bay, Texas on June 19, 1865. This date would go down in American history books as the day that chattel slavery was ended and is celebrated every year as the Juneteenth holiday. On June 21, 1865, another rebellious incident occurred at Camp Stanton in Beaufort worthy of mentioning, involving Private John Greer of 128th USCT Company F and Captain Edwin J. Scranton. In refusing to clean his weapon when ordered by Scranton, he replied, "My gun is as clean as any man's, and I'll be damned if I clean it until I see the colonel." When Scranton moved to arrest him with the assistance of Sergeant William Emery, Greer resisted and attempted to strike them. He was subsequently court-martialed, sentenced, and imprisoned at Fort Clinch, Florida without pay for 3 months. Scranton himself would later be court-martialed on charges of miscegenation and sentenced to be discharged from the service. He was found guilty of marrying a colored woman of bad reputation. This verdict was upheld by Major General Quincy Gilmore, in command of the Department of the South. Scranton was dismissed from the service on September 7, 1865. After the war, Major Delany was employed by the Freedmen's Bureau, but they did not trust him and grew increasingly suspicious of his politics. He was an outspoken advocate for land redistribution to the freedmen families and fair freedmen labor contracts, serving on Hilton Head at the same time as my ancestor. His former 104th USCT Lieutenant Edward M. Stober was sent to spy on Delany at Brick's Church on St. Helena Island, where he delivered a fiery speech addressing the pressing issues of the day, to an excited congregation of several hundred Gullah Geechee freedmen on July 23, 1865. Martin Delany's advice to former slaves is preserved in the archived report of Stober to the Freedmen's Bureau. It is through this confidential informant's eyes and way of thinking that we are able to gain insight into what occurred at that church. According to Strobier's report, Delany said, "But I want you to understand that we would not have become free had we not armed ourselves and fought out our independence." This statement alone could be viewed as inflammatory or at least misleading from the perspective of the spy. However, he also reports of having heard freedmen say that Delany is the only man who ever told them the truth. He was further reported to have said, "Your masters who lived in opulence kept you to hard work by some contemptible being called overseer, who chastised and beat you whenever he pleased, while your master lived in some northern town or in Europe to squander away the wealth only you acquired for him. He never earned a single dollar in his life. You men and women, every one of you around me, made thousands and thousands of dollars for your master. Only you were the means for your masters to lead the ideal and inglorious life, and to give his children the education, which he denied to you, for fear you may awake to conscience. If I look around me, I tell you all the houses of this island and in Beaufort, they are all familiar to my eye, they are the same structures which I have met with in Africa. They have all been made by the Negroes, you can see it by such exteriors, and, so you ought further to know, that all the spices, cotton, rice, and coffee has only been brought over by you, from the land of our brethren." Here he was advising the freedmen of St. Helena Island, 159 years ago to get up a community and get all the lands you can, if you cannot get any singly, and in wrapping up his speech said, "I tell you slavery is over, and shall never return again. We have now 200,000 of our men well drilled in arms and used to warfare, and I tell you, that slavery shall not come back again, if you are determined it will not return again. These are bold and profound statements to be said by anybody at this time in history. Yet for the father of black nationalism, it was just a statement of truth that he was compelled to speak. Private John Martin would have his day in court on August 16, 1865. The trial took place on Hilton Head, and according to the trial records, he defiantly denied knowing his co-conspirators and pled not guilty to the charge of desertion. My ancestor offered no testimony or defense to the courts. Just imagine being born into chattel slavery, kidnapped and forced to labor for the pro-slavery South, freed during the Carolinas campaign's march through Orangeburg, served in the Union Army, and partook in a documented act of armed desertion before even tasting a day of freedom. 25 years old with his life on the line for a charge that could have resulted in his execution, he stood there in defiance as a rebellious USCT. First Lieutenant Lester Hall of the 128th USCT was the prosecuting witness in the case, and it was from his testimony that I first learned that he deserted as part of an armed group. When asked whether the weapons and equipment had been recovered, Hall's answer was, "I don't know. There were guns brought back when the prisoner was brought back with a party of deserters, but I can't say if his is one of them." My ancestor was found guilty and sentenced to serve hard time without pay for the remainder of his term of service. On September 13, 1865, the General Order No. 35 was issued by Brevet Major General Charles Devens, designating Sing Sing Prison in Ossing, New York as the place of confinement for my ancestor and 2 of his Company G comrades. Those who did not serve time in New York were incarcerated at Castle Pinckney in the Charleston Harbor. Among the 8 prisoners listed in the orders, 4 of them were members of USCT 128th Company G, including Private John Martin, Corporal Henry Furry, Private Taro Ashmo, and Private Abraham Murant. Private George Williams was from Company A of the 128th USCT. Also included in the orders were Sergeant Richard Riley and Private Mike Kappas of the 21st USCT, Company D. Lastly, there was Private Norman Johnson of the 26th USCT, Company K. The Bureau of Military Justice ordered the immediate release of Martin, Furry, and Ashmo from Sing Sing on December 11. They were to be granted transportation to South Carolina for their discharge from service. It was not until December 22, 1865 that Private John Martin was finally discharged. The famous Frederick Douglass speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July," comes to mind, but in this historical context I am asking myself, what to the Charles McClellan alias John Martin descendants is Juneteenth? After the war, John Martin adopted the name Charles McClellan and married my 3 ex-great-grandmother Margaret Rivers, who was from Orangeburg, and together they settled down in Ridgeville, South Carolina, where they farmed and raised 12 children. Their 4th-born child, my 2 ex-great-grandmother Agnes McClellan, birthed Maggie, who birthed Edna, who birthed my mother Catherine. Thank you for listening to Martin's Rebellion, a story of black resistance in the Union Army, written and edited by Mansa Foday Ajamu. Please visit our website www.ganona.org to download a free PDF copy today.